A big new update for Elden Ring just dropped, coming in fresh with a ton of buffs, a lot of nerfs actually, but most important, a lot of really cool changes that make some of the weapons and skills and some of the incantations in the game a lot more viable. I did manage to test quite a number of these. Of course, the list and the patch notes are very lengthy, so this is likely going to take a few days until everything gets properly tested, but in this video we're gonna go over the highlights as well as the patch notes, so let's begin. Now, weapon buffs was one of the major highlights of the new update 1.04, and especially strength users will be happy to know that colossal weapons have been buffed across the board in terms of weapon damage, weapon attack speed, and lowered recovery rates, but with the exception of course of the jumping attacks, which were already powerful and they will stay as it is. So for colossal swords and weapons, they've increased the weapon attack speed and they have lowered the recovery times, as I've said, and they've also increased the two-handed attack damage of colossal swords and weapons, again, but with the exception of the jumping attacks. Another big buff was the increase to physical block rate and guard boost of colossal swords, colossal weapons, great swords and great hammers, great axes, great spears, and halberds. That's actually a pretty big incentive to now two-hand these colossal weapons instead of dual wielding them with two separate colossal weapons, which was the case in the previous updates. I'm curious to see if the meta changes in that regard, since now you get that nice boost to damage, and more important, you also get to block quite a bit. The weapons feel snappier, so now you're going to have an easier time to, well, just engage with enemies and not get overwhelmed in case they are more agile than you. Also, a few other colossal specific buffs. For example, Grafted Blade Sword has seen its damage increase directly, separately from the colossal weapons getting those buffs in general, and also the Devourer Scepter has seen its damage increased likewise. But let's move over to sorceries. We've seen yet again this category receiving a ton of buffs, especially in terms of cast speed increase and decreasing recovery rates for some of the slower spells or undesirable ones in the previous update. Starting with the Crystal Barrage, it received that cast speed increase and the recovery rate is also better in the new update, though the difference is barely noticeable. This was already a pretty fast spell, and the only difference I was able to notice was in the bullet travel time or crystal travel time. It seems that they are a bit faster than in the previous updates, and the speed, if there's any in terms of cast time, is minimal at best. Another spell that has received a buff was Reichers Rancor, though I kind of wished it was more than just mana cost reduction. Its FP cost was reduced from 35 to 26 from my testing, so that's quite welcomed. You can use it a little bit earlier in the game, and it's a very devastating spell in the right hands, especially if you go up against large bosses and can ensure you hit with all of those explosions. The two Darkmoon versions, Rani's Darkmoon and Renala's Darkmoon, are also buffed in terms of cast speed and recovery rates, so the buff on this is even more noticeable than the Crystal Barrage. You will definitely notice it when you unleash it the first time. It's definitely like 1 millisecond or 2 milliseconds faster than in the previous updates, but more important, that recovery rate will let you cast a second one and a third one way faster than before, so it's going to like be even more noticeable when you chain cast them and you throw a bunch at the enemy before the fight begins, or when you have enough room to do so. Now, the next one that I've tested was the Rolling Magma. This has seen its cast speed increased, and again, the time for the magma needs to explode has also been decreased. So now from my testing, it seems that there's an approximately 10 millisecond difference between the new and the last update in the favor of the new update version. So the new update version is about 10 milliseconds faster than the previous update, which is quite welcomed, but I'm not really sure it's going to make this spell any more viable than before. It still feels slow, especially for that magma explosion to kick off. It still feels like it's too long and it should have received a much better buff than how it did so far. Briars of Sin and Briars of Punishment are definitely a surprise. On the other hand, they've increased that, well, decreased the recovery time, and they've increased the blood loss buildup on the enemy, so now they are a little bit more viable than before. Obviously, you might want to also mix in some arcane in here and play with the staff that also gives you some more buffs to blood loss and to like thorn sorceries. In this case, it definitely feels that there's also a damage difference with the exact same build as before of about 1 to 200 points, and also it seems that it's super easy now to trigger that blood loss, even with this build right here that I have that did not have any points invested into arcane. So this is definitely something that I'm gonna build around and see how it works in the new update. Now, in terms of ancient dragon spells like Lancix Glaive, the ancient dragons, Lightning Strike and Lightning Spear, and even like some of the Lightning Strikes have received some really good buffs. So for Lancix Glaive, they decreased the FP and stamina cost, increased the cast speed, and lowered recovery time, but more important, they made it more easily to withstand enemy attacks while casting so you don't get interrupted. It's definitely way more noticeable than ever before. I'm pretty sure that it's a significant buff for the Lancix Glaive right here, so it's a lot more viable than before. In general, I think that you're going to want to build around ancient dragon spells, as now they are more powerful than ever before. They were already like nuts in the previous ones, they're even more so right now. The same goes for the ancient Lightning Strike, recovery time has decreased, and for the ancient dragon Lightning Spear, FP and stamina cost has also been reduced, and the cast speed has been increased, while recovery time has also been lowered. Lightning Strike was another one that got a major buff in terms of stamina cost, but more important, they've increased that cast speed and the recovery time has also been decreased. So now spamming this feels amazing. Like, this was already a good spell before, but not top tier. Well, with this buff, it might just be very close to that, since it just unleashes those lightning strikes super fast with the new update. The same happened with the Frozen Lightning Spear, which has seen similar buffs, but Black Blade was another one that was quite a nice surprise. I would have thought that, yeah, From Software would just, well, reduce the damage on this or just nerf it. Well, it just got another buff, so they've decreased the stamina consumption and also decreased the recovery time. This is especially noticeable on the subsequent cast that you do following the first one. It's way faster, so you can unleash the two bolts way easier. It's even more noticeable now against bosses. The damage is just as insane, and the bonus effect is that the health bar now also has an indicator for that health reduction that you applied to it, so you no longer have to go in blind and, well, just calculate how much you reduced that enemy's HP, so quite welcomed. Now, as I've said, these are not the only buffs in the game. There's plenty more I encourage you to go ahead and check out. We are also going to check out some of the nerfs in a little bit, but in the meantime, I want to check out those weapon skills and Ashes of War, with a few in mind that stood out in particular, starting with the Black Flame Tornado, an amazing one in the previous update. Well, they've added hitboxes to the weapon when spinning it, and also added a window that you can use to roll out during the attack to cancel the animation. So now if there's any incoming attack and you know you're gonna get hit, you can interrupt that animation in like a split second and then immediately follow up with a roll. It definitely works really well, but there is a small delay that you need to pay attention to. Not really sure about the hitbox on the weapon, since the hitbox on the spell itself is larger, so I'm not sure you want to wait for, well, the enemy to get close to even be hit by the weapon, because it's too late at that point. Shield Crash, a skill, or while Ash of War we talked about literally today, has also seen a buff, so they've decreased the stamina cost and increased the cast speed. So literally that build that we posted a few hours ago is now way stronger than ever before. I heavily encourage you to go ahead and check it out. It definitely feels that there's a small difference in there, but that stamina cost is definitely the banger and what's going to make it a lot more desirable in the new update. Magma Guillotine, which is the skill you find on the Magma Worm Scale Sword, has seen its stamina cost decreased. They've increased the cast speed and decreased recovery time on the follow-up of input, which is just amazing. The weapon was already crazy good if you knew what you were doing. Well, now you're gonna have an easier time to perform those high Magma Guillotine attacks, and also the subsequent ones are even easier to cast up now with the increase in that cast speed and decrease in recovery time. And of course, on a final note, let's also talk about some of the nerfs that unfortunately also came with the new update. Of course, this is not the entire list, but just some of the ones that stood out. So Adula's Moonblade, one of my favorite spells in the game, they've decreased the power of the single cast and improved performance so that the blades and the frost hit more consistently and continuously. Yeah, what basically means is that it's going to deal way less damage than before. It's not even comparable. In the previous update, it was just nuts. In the new one, it is going to almost always hit with two blades at the same time in just one cast, but the damage is heavily reduced. Another unfortunate nerf for a spell that you likely use to cheese some of the bosses in the game was Swarm armor flies, well, its bloodlust buildups on enemies has been decreased in the new update, unfortunately. The same goes with the Frenzied Burst and Flame of Frenzy and most of the madness stuff in the game. They've decreased the madness buildup on enemies for both of these two skills, and they've also shortened the length of the madness afflicted animation and finally lowered the speed of madness buildup recovery. So overall, I guess they wanted to balance madness a little bit, since you could instantly, well, just apply madness to enemies in PvP. I guess that makes sense. Finally, they've decreased the scaling of status effect buildup from spells and incantations on the Albinoric Staff and Dragon Communion Seal, and decreased the effects of the Great Shield Talisman for weapons with high block rates. Yeah, and that's not all of them. Of course, can go ahead and check out the rest of the patch notes. It's even bigger, I believe, than the previous one, and we're gonna cover a lot more in the upcoming days. As always, if you want to stay up to date with anything Elden Ring related, definitely make sure you leave a like on this video, subscribing to the channel and activating that notification bell would be super appreciated, and I'll see you guys in the next one.